Chapter 22, 19th Century Realistic Opera. Now, during the 19th century, towards the middle of the 19th century, we start to see a change in the plots of opera, okay? And the plots start to model themselves after what's going on in real life, okay? So we have this shift towards what we call social realism. People are concerned about issues with everyday life and having everyday kind of characters, and they're portrayed in a realistic way. Lots of times, the cast of an opera is, or the roles are they deal with these lower classes and the issues of the lower class would deal with. So we find this aesthetic value in the ordinary or even the ugly. Some of us are very pessimistic. And as I said, this is a trend that starts, in the latter half of the Romantic period. You know, some of this really comes out as a reaction to the Industrial Revolution. Now, remember, the Industrial Revolution happens. It happens in Europe and in the U.S. And people are emerging to these cities for jobs, and people are working in factories and whatnot. But when we start to see this industrial revolution, you have to keep in mind many of the laws we have today weren't in effect. So you don't have, there's no regulation of like a work week. So you have a lot of people overworked. Health and safety hazards were another thing in the industrial revolution. There was no OSHA. There was no people regulating safety hazards for factories. So you would have people getting maimed or killed on the job, and so these are the types of things that people are reacting to. Okay, several of the kind of ill effects. Child labor was another thing. People being exploited. So some of the plots that we're going to see in opera, they kind of read like tabloid headlines. And for those of you who may not know what a tabloid is, if you ever go to the checkout lines in stores and you see, the big tabloids right by the newspapers, and they're kind of these crazy, crazy stories and stuff like that. They were the original tabloids, and they have them in big bold letters to kind of grab the person's attention to sell newspapers. But we look at Bizet's Carmen, okay, and we're going to look at this in this lecture. Carmen's a wonderful opera. I guarantee most of you've heard the music from it. But basically, if you slim down the plot, it's a knife wielding gypsy girl. She gets arrested in a cigarette factory. Pagliacci is another opera that comes out later on in the 19th century, and a jealous clown, he stabs his wife to death. And then we look at Tosca. Tosca is the abused singer, and she murders this police chief. So again, these operas are coming, and they're being based in kind of like this real life, everyday life, everyday situations. We're going to look at the opera called Carmen. Okay, and the opera was written by Georges Bizet. He's a French composer, and the opera itself takes place in Spain. So, in the 19th century, composers of the Romantic period, lots of them are looking for referencing exotic cultures. So you're going to see different faraway lands. Especially in Asia, you'll set them in Japan or Southeast Asia. Spain was another place that people thought was the kind of this exotic culture. So we do see a lot of operas being set in Spain. So the main character, it's her name's Carmen. She's a seductive gypsy woman. Okay, and just like many other operas of the 19th century, the opera doesn't end well. We have these violent endings. Okay, usually the main characters either end up dying, either murderous or so forth, and that's one of the main themes of the Romantic period. We have love, death. We have that fascination with the supernatural in opera, and then also not as much opera, but in literature we have this the people embracing nature. So when the opera was premiered, it was, so a lot of the hoity-toity, the Parisians, they considered it obscene. Okay, they were kind of put off by it, mainly because there was cigarette smoking on stage, which they didn't think was appropriate, and the title character was a seductive gypsy woman, seducing these men, and that was not appropriate for like a national theater. But this opera, Carmen, is probably one of the most famous operas that we have today. And aside from like one or two operas by Verdi, it's probably the most performed opera in the world today. It's a phenomenal opera. I definitely would strongly encourage you guys, if you want to see an opera and you're new to opera, this is a great opera to go see if you're just coming to opera for the first time. The scene that we're going to look at is we're going to look at that like the habanero aria. Okay, habanero just translates from Havana, and we're taking these kind of these dance rhythms from like Spanish culture. So you have like this bum, ba bum, 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 ba bum, 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 and this kind of rhythm goes over and over again. Now, keep in mind, throughout the opera, you see a lot of other Spanish elements getting infused in this opera. Another thing that's going to be happening in this aria is we have a descending chromatic line that the singer sings. And this descending chromatic line is very, very kind of seductive. And this is, mind you, keep in mind, when Carmen comes on stage, she comes on stage and she's singing this aria. So this is our introduction to her. Let's listen to it. So that's Carmen. That's the habanero from Carmen. So make sure you go back though on Canvas and watch the actual full aria though. I have two different versions up there. I want to shift gears now and move from France to Italy. And probably one of the most important Italian composers of opera that we're going to talk about is this guy, Giacomo Puccini. His dates are 1858 to 1924. And he's coming at the latter half of the 19th century. It says he's the heir to the tradition of Verdi. Now, remember, Verdi, we talked about being an Italian composer of opera as well. And he writes a ton of operas like, Il Trovatore, and he's writing in this like bel canto style, or this beautiful lyrical singing style. And Puccini he's falling into that category. All of his operas are extremely lyrical. They're very, very lush harmonies, and they're gorgeous. They really are. So he definitely kind of encapsulates this entire genre of opera in the late 19th century. Now, some of his operas, he has listed Madame Lescaut, La Boheme, Tosca, Madame Butterfly, and Turandot. I mean, they're kind of his big operas. I want to bring your attention, though, to La Boheme. We're going to talk about that opera in the next slide. But that's probably one of the most famous operas that gets performed today. And I think the Met performs it every year. In Britain, there's their version of the Met's called Covent Garden. They perform it, if not every year, every other year. And it's probably definitely the most performed opera. It's a great opera, just like Carmen. If you've never seen an opera and you're new to it and you want it as your first opera, go see La Boheme. You won't be disappointed. It's really the music's awesome, and so forth. Now these operas, they take place and they fall under this category of what we call verismo opera. And that just means that the plots are based on kind of realistic life. The characters are realistic characters, kind of everyday characters. and we'll see this in La Boheme as well. So La Boheme is Puccini's most famous opera. Definitely, it's as I said, it's performed more than any other opera in the world. It's a Verismo opera, and it's set in Paris. Okay, and the opera explores love, hope, and despair. It's basically two characters fall in love. They're in love with their love, but guess what? One gets sick, and then she doesn't make it to the end. Well, she does make it to the end, but bad things happen. But again, the idea, music, transcending the limitations of opera. Okay, the story for La Boheme, the narrative is basically they base the musical Rent on La Boheme. They just kind of updated it, but we're going to see this lyrical bel canto singing throughout. Okay, one thing that really makes this kind of a different opera or a different animal than like Verdi and its predecessors is with Puccini's operas, we see a kind of a less distinctive, distinction between recitatives and aria. Everything's going to start to blend together. Okay, whereas Verdi, he'd have recitatives, and he definitely would have the orchestra much more involved in the recitatives. But here, you're going to have these big, big lyrical moments, and then maybe some small, and then maybe it will get thinner, and then, thicker, and so forth. You do have arias and duets and so forth, but it's much, much more, there's less distinction. So we have like two characters, the poor poet Rodolfo, and the equally impoverished Mimi. She's a seamstress, and they fall in love. So basically, the situation is, Mimi lives downstairs, Rodolfo and his roommates live upstairs, and her candle goes out. And I think she needs a match, and so she goes up to ask for a light for a candle. She knocks on the door, and then she's charmed by this, Rodolfo. She's charmed by this lovely woman who comes in, and the wind, she comes in, the wind blows the candle out again, and then she drops her key. And it's dark. He's nervous because he likes her and so forth. And so what they do is they're searching around in the darkness to find this key. And in the darkness, though, he accidentally grabs her hand, and that's all. He's holding her hand, and then he seizes the moment to tell her about himself and his hopes. And that's kind of what this aria is going to be about. I'm going to play a couple of the excerpts from this aria. It basically, Chaglindia Manana, what a frozen little hand. That's what it roughly translates to. So I'm going to play for you some of these examples, but let's go back on canvas and watch the video because you can see the characters interacting, number one. You hear the music, and also I have subtitles. So the beginning of the conversation, kind of as a recitative, let's listen. So that was the character. That was Rodolfo. Again, in the music, it's there, but it's going to start and stop in small phrases rather than do this big nonstop aria with this steady tempo underneath. We're going to get there, but we're not there yet. Let's listen to the next one. This is a gradual trajectory of the voice going from lower into higher. So again, you have this building, and you're going to have these big moments where the tenor's voice is soaring and so forth. And this is quintessential Puccini. That's kind of what people are going, and that's what they want to see, this build up, build up, build up, and these gorgeous kind of melodies, flowing over top of a very, very colorful orchestra accompaniment. One more example of increasing passion and emotion. So again, that's La Boheme. It's some gorgeous stuff. It's a phenomenal opera. I can't emphasize enough, and it's well worth checking out. So this concludes our brief discussion on Chapter 22, Realistic Opera. We looked at Carmen by George Bizet, and we looked at La Boheme by Puccini.